Once again, Blizzard proves themselves to be one of my dear closest viewers, because after yesterday's video wishing about some more further tuning, pleading Blizzard to not forget this second part of Season 3 without any more balanced tuning before the release of Season 4, guess what we have? The day after, we have the announcement that we're gonna get, next reset, more balanced tuning to more specs. This time around, there's not gonna be too much drama about specs being nerfed, because this balanced tuning is gonna be just about buffs instead. So let me stop you right there. If you were expecting some nerfs, maybe to Havoc, maybe to Vengeance, maybe to Rogues, perhaps why not Augmentation or Demo Warlock? No, it's just buffs for today. Let's start with the simple, quick and easy buffs. The first one goes to Blood Decay, which is just a blood shield now giving you more armor based on your strength. This type of tank right now is not particularly popular at the moment in the meta. On top of this, one of the major weaknesses of Blood Decay is being weak in the very high keys. When you start taking so much damage, you have so little mitigation and you're supposed to heal yourself with the damage you're taking, but you just don't have time because you die too quickly. So this is helping Blood be a little bit more tanky overall. In terms of damage increase, Blood gets nothing in terms of DPS. The actual damage buffs are going to Frost and Unholy. 4%, both of them across the board. Now, being equally buffed would lead us to believe that they are both right now equally in the same situation, both requiring the same amount of buffs, which is interesting because with the data, with the numbers we have right now, Unholy has been outperforming Frost. Even though in Mythic Plus they are equally unpopular, both of them. When it comes to the raid, they are both doing rather poorly. But in terms of sheer numbers in the raid, in terms of logs right now in Mythic, you look at the difference between DK Unholy and DK Frost, and the damage is more or less the same. Where you do see a larger difference is when you move over to Mythic Plus. In Mythic Plus is where Unholy is not only more popular, but it also is doing more damage than a Frost DK. So it's interesting, the idea of just flat out buffing them, both of them by 4%. Maybe Frost, is what I'm trying to say, could have gotten a little bit of a bigger bump up in terms of damage compared to Unholy. We do have, though, some of the larger sets of buffs, starting with Feral Druid. The damage increase to Feral is more or less going to touch the majority of their damage profile outside of Ferocious Bite. As you can see here, basically everything from Rip to the AoE portion of Ferocious Bite, Rampant Ferocity, down to then Rake, Primal Wrath, Feral Frenzy, all of those have gotten buffed. This should be around a 6-ish% damage increase for Feral. So what's the situation for Feral right now? In Mythic Plus, it's not really relevant whatsoever when it comes to the popularity in the raid. Feral is also amongst the lowest in terms of how often you're gonna see one. In terms of damage, overall, yes, as we mentioned multiple times, it's not that the overall damage meter is always definitive, but even then, Feral is not even being that particularly exciting. Looking at their actual numbers in-game, so rather than looking at a confusing bar that doesn't really tell you quite much the full picture, these are the actual results from the logs, and this is the logs of Mythic Plus Feral, which is doing one of the lowest DPS out of all of the specs right now in Mythic Plus. If we move over to the raid, in Mythic difficulty, Feral Druid is still quite on the low end of results. So one of the specs, if we actually had to name the specs that might have needed a buff, flat out, no more need to elaborate on why, it would have been Feral. So it's just a flat out good choice to buff Feral Druid at this moment. Also, importantly, this is a buff that will have a similar powerful effect in both single target, raiding, as well as Mythic Plus AoEing. So it's good for both. In terms of the buffs. What is not good for both, and possibly not good for either, is the buff that Restoration Druid is getting, which is the buff to basically just your mana. So Resto Druid right now, if we once more go back and check the results, this time looking at the HPS, Resto Druid has been technically amongst the lowest ones in terms of healing. Overall, the performance in the raid. We can also switch once more looking at our bars from Warcraft logs, and you can find Resto Druid still being towards the bottom, not doing too well. Obviously, these type of results, the HPS results, don't matter nearly as much for the Mythic Plus setting, where mana is much less of a problem than the raid. So this type of buff to Resto Druid is way more raid focused, where they have a much larger, a much bigger problem in basically not going out of mana too quickly. This is a much more focused mana discount given to Resto Druid for the raid. Mythic Plus is not really that big of a deal at the moment for Resto Druid. Talking about flat out buffs, and once more curious that Blizzard decides to fix themselves on this 4%, the buff is to survival, and that's also a 4% damage buff. No surprise, survival continues to be one of the least popular of the specs in this season. In terms of flat out performance, this is the mythic raiding results of survival, which sees them quite low, basically barely passing 200,000, which is sort of the mid to low level in terms of results. And then you have this one, which is the performance of survival in Mythic Plus, which is also towards the bottom side of results in terms of damage. So buffing them by 4%, I guess it's decent. If you had to go straight up by the numbers, this 213.6 thousand would turn into a 222,000 post buff. Obviously, even if you turned into 222, it would still be lower, far lower than basically everyone besides maybe tying with Fury Warrior. You know, that's it. So even after this buff, it's not that it's gonna be enough for you to magically turn survival into a much better performing spec. At the very least, they are still being given something. Like, for example, one of the specs missing from Hunter, which is marksmanship, that is not getting anything. For example, even though the performance of marksmanship is similarly bad in terms of results when you compare survival, which is also getting buffed, and yet marksmanship is not. That's a kind of an interesting take from Blizzard in missing out on marksmanship. Obviously, no need to buff Beast Mastery. Talking about buffs, this time for Paladin, we now move into straight up damage buffs. Unlike the mana discounts for Resto, Holy Paladin exclusively gets damage increase. This is to Shield of the Righteous and to Consecration for Holy Paladin. Now, these two put together for a Holy Paladin can even go as high as being 10-ish% of your damage, provided you remember to keep Consecration down, more or less on cooldown. That can be upwards of a 10% damage increase when it comes primarily to Mythic Plus and primarily to AoE, which is a decent weakness to fix, because at the moment, as you can see, Holy Paladin has the weakest of the damage out of all healers in Mythic Plus by a reasonable margin, so knowing you get buffed is good. However, this buff is at best going to bump you up by about 10%. You see this number here. Even if it's buffed by 10%, it's gonna go all the way up to 38,000 at best, which still leaves you quite far down pretty much all of the other healers in terms of damage. In fact, the only one you're matching is gonna be Resto Shaman, except not, because Resto Shaman will also be buffed in damage. You know, spoilers for what's about to come. So it's good that the damage of Holy Paladin is being addressed. It's bad that what is being addressed is just not strong enough to give them any more reasonable damage increase. Perhaps the surprise of the day is a series of buffs to Ret Paladin. Now, don't get too surprised or think this is way too much, because Wake of Ashes, Truth's Wake, and Seething Flames are basically all cooked in a single ability in Wake of Ashes. They're all part of the same button, plus the other two, Blade of Justice and Final Verdict. Now, these three together can still total to become upwards of 6 to even 7% damage increase. This is interesting because back to the DPS part of the meters in the raid, as well as the DPS part of the meters in Mythic Plus, Ret is not exactly on the weak side in terms of damage, right? This is Ret in AoE. They're still no doubt losing to specs like Outlaw, to specs like Demo, specs like Demon Hunter, no surprise, but it's a decent number at the moment. If we were, for example, to increase this number magically by 7%, they would spike up to 244,000. which would put them at the second, third, fourth best DPS right now in Mythic Plus in terms of AoE. Single target would perhaps be slightly lower because of the lower damage of Wake of Ashes, down to maybe 6%, and their damage would still be quite high because you would jump from 213,000 to 225,000, which would put you at, again, second, third best, fourth maybe best, you know, again, very high level for red, which is what is interesting, because if you were to think about, you know, your top 5 specs in need of some more damage this patch, I don't think we would have put red, even though overall in the raid it's kind of mediocre. It's also surprising because it remains, for example, a super popular spec, yet it gets buffed on top of that. So also it's not particularly underplayed in Mythic Plus. It's definitely not the flavor of the month pick compared to some others, but it's definitely not dead like some others. So interesting that Blizzard went for buffing Red Paladin. After Red, we have another set of decent buffs. This one is to Holy Priest. This is now the third set of buffs in a row to Holy Priest. You have the extra healing on Sanctify, plus on Heal, plus on Flesh Heal, and then you have the damage increase to Justice, to Smite, and to Shadow War Pain. Now this is still another tiny increase over time to Holy. These buffs are okay. In the raid, it's upwards of 4-ish% more healing, because you're not really going to be healing with Heal a lot, and not much with Flesh Heal either. It's mostly about Sanctify, which can be upwards of 4 or so percent. You also have to consider the Mastery, which is going to benefit from this buff. In Mythic Plus, it can be even more healing than this, because you're going to be using Flesh Heal even more in Mythic Plus. Some priests nowadays are even running Heal as well, so that's a double buff to your healing in Mythic Plus. Not that in Mythic Plus the problem of Holy Priest was healing, so it's less important. The damage buff is perhaps a bit more unfortunate, because if we go in one of the pain points of Mythic Plus as a priest, it's definitely not the HPS, which in Mythic Plus it doesn't matter much, more so the damage. Damage of Holy Priest right now has been buffed a couple of times. Now it's still mediocre. It's still lower than most of the other specs. With this buff, you can get a solid 5% damage increase. Unfortunately, the majority of your damage, the majority of the damage you care about in Mythic Plus is not being buffed, because you care about AoE. So you care about Divine Star, about Halo, about Holy Fire, AoE splashing the damage around, Divine Image, duplicating that damage, Holy Nova, AoE. None of this is being touched. Instead, just purely single target stuff is being buffed. So it's only going to be more visible in single target situation and not nearly as much in terms of large AoE pools. But still, this number should grow into the 48-ish thousand. Shadow Priest gets another buff. We continue down the clown world of Blizzard, now changing Psychic Link about 60 times. It was nerfed all the way back down, I think, to 10 or 15%, and then buffed up to 25, now buffed again up to 30%. Your other core abilities like Mind Blast and Devouring Plague are buffed as well. This is going to net you overall a 3 to 4% damage increase when it comes to Shadow, which is not going to change much given the gap you had with other specs. When it comes to the raid, is perhaps the best result compared to your damage in Mythic Plus, because in Mythic Plus you were slightly more competitive, and also this buff with Psychic Link is going to be stronger in AoE, so you will have a better result doing more damage in AoE. After this buff, you should be able to break into the 235,000 plus range in Mythic, which starts to match other specs like BM Hunter, for example, starts to match specs like Fire Mage, for example, so it's more competitive compared to the number increasing in the raid, where also you continue to be amongst the weakest of the specs. After Priest, you have the buffs given to Resto Shaman, double buff. Flat out 5% more healing to Resto Shaman and damage increase to their single target, Lava Burst, Flame Shock and Lightning Bolt. Now, these three damage increases together are going to bring Resto Shaman at almost a 10+% damage increase. The more the fight is focused on single target, the more it gets to 10, even 11 or 12% more damage. The more it's AoE based, it goes down to 6 or 7% damage increase for Resto. This is still good in Mythic Plus. We mentioned Holy Paladin going up to 38,000. Well, no dice, because Holy Paladin gets closer to Holy Priest, but Holy Priest gets buffed. And then Holy Paladin gets closer to Resto Shaman, and Resto Shaman gets buffed. So now you're gonna have both Resto Shaman and Holy Priest being much closer, much more tied to Mistweaver, to Resto Druid, to Preservation Evoker, and not that closely, but still closer than before, Discipline Priest. The healing increase is what is perhaps a bit more confusing, because if you go into the raid in Mythic HPS, the HPS Resto Shaman was already doing just fine. Even if we go into a different metric and look at the metric of the healing from Warcraft logs, Resto Shaman was doing fine. If you look at the per second amounts, even if you look at the top Chad healers, Resto Shaman was competitive. And now they get buffed overall flat out by 5%. So if we were to look at these results of what the top healers can do, assuming top HPS even matters in the raid, 5% of this is going to be 13,000 more. So they are gonna go to 273,000, putting themselves at a decent, comfortable second place in the raid. That's what perhaps is a bit more weird in terms of buffs, similar to Red Paladin being buffed in damage. Not just buffing the damage of Resto Shaman, which is okay, it was needed, but the healing as well of Resto Shaman is perhaps a little bit more unexpected. We then have the tiny buff, similar to the tiny buff given to Blood DK to Protection Warrior. Vanguard now gives you more stamina than before, 40% instead of 35%, and the absorption of Ignore Pain has been increased by 5%. So, flat out, good, passive, extra bonuses given to Protection Warrior, which is not, we wouldn't call Protection Warrior a very popular tank right now in the meta, so it's a good addition to Prot. The last of the buffs is to Arms. So Arms is getting particularly their AoE damage increased, they're getting Cleave damage increased, Dreadnought, so their splashing damage of Overpower increased, Deep Wounds, basic dot damage also increased, and then the 4-piece set bonus damage increase of Thunderclap, so AoE is also increased. This still nets out to be a 3% or so damage in single target, but more importantly, it can go up to 6 or 7% damage increase when it comes to AoE, of course, given that the buffs were more focused on doing more AoE, cleave, splash damage. So Arms, who has had a clear weakness and also was being gapped by Fury when it came to AoE damage, with this buff they will be able to get upwards and past the 220,000 range for when they are now, which is going to be enough to make them match or even slightly above Fury Warrior when it comes to AoE damage. For single target, the buff is not nearly as big, which is also somewhat sad considering in single target they were also just as weak as they were in AoE. The buff is only going to bring them up to 215, 216,000 overall damage in the raid, which still leaves them as one of the least powerful of the specs. It might help close the gap a little bit more in terms of the damage results that we're seeing here, where Fury is doing well and Arms is most definitely not doing well. At the very least, it's another one of the specs that is being targeted by the buffs. At the end of the day, if we look at all of the bottom performers in the raid, for example, Feral is buffed, Arms is buffed, Unholy is buffed, buffed. So we have this entire streak of weak specs being buffed in the raid, which is, I guess, good enough for now. Same goes for Mythic Plus. We have gotten a few other specs all towards the bottom being buffed. Obviously, this is the point where people then start complaining. Why, since we are talking about low specs, why isn't Affliction being buffed? Why isn't Mark Machine being buffed? Why isn't Devastation being buffed? What about Elemental Shaman somehow skipping past the buffing decisions of Blizzard? And as we mentioned at the start of the video, what about the nerfs? What about, for example, these two, just to name a couple? What if we name 4 of them and we add Fire Mage and Demonology Warlock, for example? Right? That's what perhaps some players are going to go about. However, even if we might still bitch about a few things missing or not being there in terms of buffs, we at the very least can be happy that we are continuing to have the balance tuning, since just the other day we were worried we might have not really gotten any more perhaps in this second part of the season. Good to know, still good to know that the balancing is continuing so far. So with the display and the announcement of all of the changes planned for next reset, we are now leaving each other on this Saturday. We're starting the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can also still be given completely for free. You can like and comment down below, as well as subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, I was about to blow up as I was finishing the video, but I made it.